Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out when did the Cold War actually start by History Matters. There's really no definitive answer as to where it started because there were many events, many things which led to the Cold War. So there's definitely not just one answer of, oh yeah, it started this day of this month of this year. No, that's not the case. In my own opinion, it started right after World War II ended, or even slightly before, when it was made clear that the Soviets were not liberating Eastern Europe, but rather oppressing it and installing their own Soviet puppets to make puppet governments. That's when it started, in my opinion. But let's see what they have to say.
The Cold War often conjures up images of divided continents, nuclear standoff and proxy wars fought all over the world. It was a decades-long competition between communist and capitalist economies, between democratic and authoritarian political frameworks, and between value systems that ended with the dissolution of the USSR and the end of communism in Eastern Europe. And whilst this end date isn't the subject of too much debate, when the Cold War began exactly is much more nebulous, with most assuming that it starts in the wake of the Second World War. But given the obvious enmity that existed from day one between the Bolshevik revolutionaries and the rest of the non-communist world, how do we know when the Cold War actually started? Now, obviously, given that the Cold War wasn't actually a war, choosing a definitive starting date is going to be difficult. It's not like there was ever a formal declaration of not being at war, but being very suspicious of those guys. And as such, it's always going to be up to interpretation. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical competition.
Everyone's going to have a different date.
Worlds for dominance, where both blocs sought to undermine and ultimately destroy the other. So when is the earliest you could say that this begins? Well, depending on whose perspective you're looking through, it was pretty early. As of 1917 and the October Revolution, the newly empowered Bolsheviks didn't exactly get along with, well,
everybody.
By coming to power, they had removed a vital military ally from the Entente powers during World War I. And immediately after taking power, the Bolsheviks were quick to renege on Russia's previous commitments to the West, by refusing to pay back money loaned to Russia and releasing secret documents to embarrass Britain and France. As the Bolsheviks fought for control of the remnants of the Russian Empire, the Entente, and also Germany, whilst it was still able to at least, tried to aid the Bolsheviks' enemies, the Whites. Long story short, this didn't work, and after a few years of fighting, Lenin's Bolsheviks were victorious and they established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. The Western response to this was to, well, ignore it and hope that the communists just sort of went away. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Well, I guess Lenin did, but the USSR survived, and so Western powers had to learn how to deal with it. As a result of the war, most of them were broke, and Britain sought to normalise trade with the resource-rich Soviet Union to help its economy bounce back. However, there was a lot of opposition to having a relationship that amounted to anything more than trade. In 1924, after the Labour Party came to power for the first time, Ramsay MacDonald, the new Prime Minister, was quick to recognise the Moscow government and begin diplomatic relations, something which did not go down well at all with the rest of Britain's political class. Soon after this, Italy and France recognised the USSR too, but that doesn't mean that they got along. One of the issues plaguing early relations was the Soviet Union's support for political radicals.
Many countries recognize Russia, but they don't get along with them. Hint, hint, every one of Russia's neighbors because they fucking hate them.
In the West, as well as all of the spying stuff. When the British government discovered that Soviet trade envoys were in fact stealing military documents, it broke off relations. And in Moscow, there was a genuine fear that Britain would form an alliance with Poland and go to war over it. This didn't happen, and despite this war scare, Soviet leadership was quick to return to supporting dissidents and conducting espionage. Now, obviously, this wasn't a one-sided affair, and the Western powers were also quick to spy on Moscow and worked hard to geopolitically isolate it. But the difference between this period and the post-World War II landscape...
Regardless of who you would side with, I'm always going to be against the communists, the Russians. Fuck them. They're the reason Eastern Europe is fucking, what, 50 years behind Western Europe. Luckily, at least Poland managed to somehow kind of catch up to Western Europe, but still, not on the same level.
...landscape was that the anti-communists weren't united behind a single leading country. In fact, the countries that would later form the backbone of NATO were themselves extremely divided at this point. Whilst the British and French governments disliked communism intensely, it was nothing compared to the hatred for it coming out of Berlin, Rome, and also Tokyo. Germany actively sought to build a subtly named anti-Soviet alliance, the Anti-Comintern Pact, and after Spain had descended into civil war, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union all sent weapons and soldiers to fight for their respective sides. The Japanese and Soviets even briefly came to blows in Mongolia. However, the Japanese quickly learned that was a bad idea. Expansionism by Germany, Japan, and as always, to a much lesser extent, Italy made the democratic powers much more hostile. When the Soviet attempt to make an anti-German alliance with the West fell through and the Soviet-backed Spanish side in the Civil War was defeated, the USSR's leaders reasoned that there was now more to gain by getting on board with Germany, which, to be fair to them, there was. Now, across the
Unfortunately.
Atlantic, the Americans were much more consistent in their approach towards the new communist government in Moscow, in that they completely ignored it. Its citizens were also owed money, and it wasn't until 1933 that Franklin Roosevelt actually recognized Stalin's government, mostly because American businessmen figured that they could make more from the USSR's growing economy and thirst for imports. Now, whilst the distrust from the West, the spying, the geopolitical maneuvering, and the attempts to stop the spread of communism seem very Cold War-y, to the overwhelming majority of nations, the main threat wasn't the Soviets, but Germany or Japan. In fact,
yeah, at
the
this point in
USSR,
time, it was
whilst
definitely
acknowledged as a great power, wasn't
Germany.
exactly feared militarily.
But Germany and the USSR started World War II together. Also, even if Germany didn't start World War II, if Hitler didn't happen, the Soviets would have started it by trying to invade the rest of Europe. So I don't really understand how some people can say that the Soviets were good, because no, they were pretty much the same as Hitler. They wanted control of everything. There was really not much of a difference. The Soviets would have invaded anyway. It would have happened eventually.
Due mostly to its defeat at the hands of Poland and its small, albeit growing, economy. It was only as the 1930s came to a close that the USSR's global position was taken more seriously. Its failure to defeat tiny Finland was offset by its annexation of the eastern half of Poland to the Baltic states and by gaining this land off of Romania. And when Berlin broke its non-aggression pact with Moscow and invaded, the Allies were quick to do whatever they could to aid the Soviets in defeating the Germans.
Unfortunate.
And as such, the ideological feud between the Soviet Union and Britain, China, France, and later on the Americans had to be put aside for this one common goal. But of course, even during the conflict, the two sides didn't exactly try.
It's a shame that the other allies helped the Soviets as much as they did. But hey, I can just watch Ukraine kick Russia's ass today. Completely destroy their economy, fuck up every single oil refinery or anything else that has to do with oil. Watching that fills me with nothing but joy. Especially watching fucking power substations, ports, ships, anything around Crimea being blown up. It's beautiful. I love it.
Trust one another. For example, the USSR was desperate for the UK and USA to open up a second front in Western Europe against Germany, which would relieve some of the pressure on the Eastern Front. Britain and the United States, however, were more than happy to bide their time with this, because
which was
that
good.
The USSR spent its people's lives fighting, that they spent theirs.
Yes,
What
let
can be
them
said
kill
for
each
certain
other.
is that
That's
after
what
the
they should
Second
have
World War
done.
had ended, relations between the two groups didn't exactly get any better, and so for many,
Unfortunately, they helped the Soviets too much. If they didn't help them at all, it would have been better, in my opinion.
having a Cold War which starts pre-war, is then ignored for a 4-year period, and then immediately kicks off again doesn't make much sense. Anyway, in the aftermath of Germany and Japan's surrenders, both sides did things that alarmed the other and raised tensions. For example, the Soviets had expected that Germany would be reunified under a single government, but the USA, UK, and France feared that a single Germany would be subject to communist influence.
Yes.
And so, better to keep it split up, thereby guaranteeing that these parts wouldn't elect a government aligned with
Good.
Moscow.
That was a good
the US
decision.
nuclear arsenal was extremely worrying to the Soviets, especially when Truman made it clear that he would use it wherever and whenever he felt he needed to. And also, the Americans' immediate ending of Lend-Lease after Japan's surrender was seen as a means of undermining Soviet efforts to rebuild the country. It wasn't
I mean,
all
that
just
was
one
good.
way, though. The Western
Don't
Allies
give
were
your
unhappy
enemies
that the
money
USSR's
or
idea of a
resources. Why would you
liberated
do
Eastern
that?
Europe was very different to theirs. And
Lend-Lease should have never been a fucking thing. Should have let the communists fucking starve themselves out and let more of them die. They were way too generous with Lend-Lease, in my opinion.
the hopes that Poland or Czechoslovakia would once again become free and independent states were soon dashed. Also, the USSR's refusal to
It's
leave
the
Iran
fucking
after the
Soviets. You
war's end
expected
and
them
its
to
constant
hold
delays in
fair and
withdrawing
free
from Manchuria
elections?
was seen as the Soviets going back on their word.
Fucking
and by
Russians.
extension, an attempt to expand its empire. What we do know for certain is that at this point, and unlike in the pre-war world, neither the Soviets nor their rivals did much to hide their distrust of the other. In 1947, these hostilities took on a new dimension, though. Truman was afraid of increasing Soviet power, and so pledged to give support to any democratic government.
Again, I don't care what fucking TikToks you watch about how, oh, communism and the Soviets were great. I'm fucking Polish. I'm from Poland. There is nothing in this world you could do that would convince me that the communists, the Russians, were better than the Western powers. Nothing.
Under threat from armed uprising, by which he meant communist uprisings. And fearing that an impoverished Europe would be more susceptible to communism's message, the United States announced the creation of the Marshall Plan, which would give economic aid to European nations ravaged by the war. The USSR, however, saw this as little more than an attempt by the United States at undermining Moscow's influence there, which wasn't an unreasonable assumption.
They're paying
given that
countries to not
unofficially,
like us.
anti-communist
They don't
governments were
need
the
to
only
pay
ones who
them.
received
Nobody
any
liked
sense
you
of
anyway.
aid, which is why in both France and Italy, the governments there kicked the communists out of government.
Very good.
Growing distrust meant that when Truman learned of upcoming elections in Romania, he demanded that Western observers be allowed to monitor it for pro-communist election rigging. Stalin happily agreed to this, on the condition that Soviet observers be given the same access to Italy's impending elections too. The demand was soon dropped. This angered the Soviets, because in the elections just held in Czechoslovakia they had respected the result, an overwhelmingly pro-Western government. The initial hope that eventually the communists there would simply just win an election were dashed when the country accepted martial aid, and in response Moscow simply ordered the Communist Party there to just overthrow the government.
Yep.
And Moscow also created Cominform, which would be used to create a unified foreign policy for communist parties across Europe, something the USA saw as being very anti-Washington, which, let's be reasonable, that's exactly what it was. And whilst these events aren't as clear-cut as an invasion, when you can say whether or not a state of war exists between two parties, the events of 1947 and the permanent change in tone between the US-led world and the Soviet-led one are why it's so often seen as the year in which the Cold War began. The problem with this is that the actions taken during that year were in response to what had previously happened. And so giving the Cold War a firm starting date of 1947 doesn't take into account all of the manoeuvring and distrust that had existed since long before then, because both sides spent the entire thing talking about how what they're doing was justified because of some previous thing that the other side had done just before that. Now obviously for some nations this date doesn't work well at all. For example, the USSR had maintained a tense relationship with Britain from its creation until the two made an alliance against Germany in 1941. And during this period, both wanted to and acted to reduce the other's influence globally.
Again, I couldn't care less what you think. Fuck the Soviets, I'm glad they're dead.
Publicly hostile to Moscow. And for those two, at least with respect to each other, 1917 or 1922 are perfectly acceptable dates for declaring the start of the Cold War. Some people will point to 1946 when Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. However, he wasn't the Prime Minister at this time, and so it made no change to British foreign policy. And in China, the Cold War was a very, very different thing, since its pre-war government outlooks were often both anti-communist and anti-Western, and its attention was entirely devoted to fighting its ongoing civil war and its war with Japan, and thus accepting help from whoever would give it. And even after the communist victory there, a unified anti-US foreign policy wouldn't last long, since China and the USSR would soon find themselves fighting and also geopolitically opposed, meaning that its Cold War is extremely hard to pin down. And so whilst 1947 is not exactly a perfect start date, for something as nebulous as the Cold War, it's probably one of the better ones. Because, let's be reasonable, we're almost certainly never going to get an agreed upon beginning.
Unfortunately, can't go back in time, can't change history. The Soviets managed to take over half of Europe for a time, but now I can rest easy knowing that they're getting completely fucked. The Russian-backed separatists in Moldova, Transnistria, they're slowly getting starved out, so that's not gonna last too long. Ukraine is fucking their asses with a dildo that's not lubed, because the dildo of consequences rarely arrives lubed. So that's great. Georgia, well, maybe soon enough the people will get so pissed they'll start shooting all the Russian-installed puppets instead of simply protesting. Would be great if they did. Armenia is already trying to move on from the Russian sphere of influence and into the Western one, the European one. So good for them. The Nordics and the Baltics are safe. So really, at this point, it's just about watching the slow decline of Russia until its economy is completely fucked, which is just going to continue happening as more sanctions get applied and as the Ukrainians keep destroying their fucking oil revenue. Which is beautiful, and I will always be filled with joy when I watch a Russian oil refinery burning or being exploded. I think at this point you understand just how much I hate the Soviets, the Russians, whatever you want to call them. Because the Russians, right now, are the exact same as they were before. Nothing has changed. They keep invading their neighbors and just fucking everything up. Which is why all their neighbors hate them. Unfortunately, there's many idiots out there in the world, so I know there's going to be at least one person who watches this video who goes, no, that's just all Western propaganda, that's all bullshit, like, fuck off. You like Russia so much, go live there. You'll change your mind. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here. And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.